So now thinking back in your school years, is there anything else you think you would talk with a professor that you need their support?
You know, while I was at San Jose State, I had a really, really good experience here. I think a large part of it had to do with my self-advocacy and not being afraid to ask for that extra help. Wherever I went, everyone was always very accommodating. I worked for the Student Health Center, now known as the Student Wellness Center, in the physical therapy department for some time. And we would sometimes need to make phone calls. And so you may imagine that was very challenging for me because when you're talking on the phone with someone who's hard of hearing, the sounds are not necessarily as clear as if you were speaking to them in person.
Okay.
And so I struggled on the phone a lot, and my boss was very understanding of that. So she would try to reduce the amount of time spent with me on the phone. And also we went ahead and got a special phone on the landline that captioned everything that was being said. So it was we call it the caption call phone. And I utilized one at home too.
Now, do you read lips?
I do sometimes. Sometimes it just kind of depends on the situation. And so when I talk to professors and give them advice of, these are things that you can do to help me, facing me on the one-on-one conversation like this can be very helpful. Sometimes in the classroom, though, it could be very tempting for them to turn around.
Right, especially they have to write on the board. Right?
Exactly. And so what I try to say to that is, turn around, write on the board, but if you can, wait to actually talk when you turn around facing the audience.
I see.
And it's not just the lip reading, it's the facial cues, looking to kind of see the expressions.
Oh, okay.
So it's kind of a bit of everything.
Okay. Is that safe for me to assume that talking with hearing loss students, they can always read lips? Is that an assumption, a safe assumption to make?
Not always.
Not always. Okay.
Probably most of them.
Okay. Is that a skill that you can be trained on, or you have to learn?
I'm sure it can be. Personally, for me, I was never trained in lip reading, but there are situations, especially for people on the deaf side of the spectrum, they will attend speech and language training with a speech and language pathologist, and so they will become very adept at reading lips, I'm sure. But for me, I actually did not receive my first pair of hearing aids until I was 11. So my language development was fairly normal.
Give us some example of what you would be asking from the faculty.
Of course. So one of the things I like to do at the beginning of the year is send an email to my professors, just let them know, hey, you have a hard of hearing student coming into your classroom, just FYI on that. A lot of times when I have gone down my education journey, I'm usually the first hard of hearing student that a teacher or professor has had. And so I like to give them a little bit of notice. I like to educate them as much as I possibly can and say.
But my understanding, usually AEC will send them a letter too. Is that correct?
That's true. That's very true. What I do is probably a lot more than what most students do, but because of my background and just
send them a letter.
So I will send them just a quick email, say, hey, I'm going to be in your class, even though the AEC probably told you already. And then what I like to do is I will, of course, come maybe a couple minutes early at the first day of school.
Introduce yourself.
Exactly, and hand off the FM system to them, so that way, they know how it works and things like that. And I like to request an appointment with them in their office hours in the beginning of the year, especially, especially if there's specific settings or projects or group things that may affect how I interact with the class. And also, too, it's helpful when we need to sign testing accommodation forms.
I see. Okay.
So,
so,
meeting during the office hours is really helpful. A lot of times I will set myself in the front of the room. And if it's in a classroom setting where people have to try to fight for seats, I like to say, this is my spot because I need it. So kind of asserting my self-advocacy
Okay.
in that sense.
Yeah, maybe can you ask the faculty to reserve that seat for you?
Yes, actually, yes, we've done that before, and there's also been situations where someone didn't know that was my seat, so I would actually go up to them and say, "Hi, my name's Erin, I'm hard of hearing, and I actually need to sit here in order to be able to know what's going on in the classroom." And people are usually very generous and understanding.
Good.
It's interesting, though, because a hearing loss is an example of a invisible disability. It's not something that you would really notice unless you started talking to the person.
Right.
So I've actually had one situation where a person wasn't exactly that generous or very understanding. So it was my first year here at San Jose State. I was working at just below in McCrory Hall at the cash register. And I had this student, she was probably a grad student, and she was asking for a lemonade to order. And for some reason that day, the term lemonade just wasn't clicking in my brain. I was hearing some other garbled gibberish that just wasn't processing, because that happens sometimes,
Right.
you know. And I asked her to repeat her order like 3 times, and finally by the 4th time, she's like, "Don't you know what a lemonade is?" And just very angry and feisty and rude. And so at that time, I was 18, and I had a pretty good idea of how to deal with situations like that. But that was probably the first time when someone really responded to me in a really rude, negative way. And so I had 2 choices. One choice would be just to say, "Oh, I'm sorry," and just kind of like ask someone else to ring up the order for her, and just kind of like hide in a corner in the back and say, "Oh my gosh, this was just not a great situation. I'm sad." Or I could, take the high road and say, "I'm going to stand up for myself," and that's what I did. And I said to the lady, I said, I'm sorry, I can't seem to hear your order very well, but ma'am, I'm hard of hearing."
Okay.
And the look on her face, it was a multitude of emotions. It was shock, it was embarrassment, and it was like, oh my goodness, I had no idea. And everything after that went super smoothly. She gave me the money, and she was like really nice. She hustled out the door really quickly, though. So she did get her lemonade, but I will have to say I never saw her again.
Okay.
So it was one of those situations where it was sad that these people don't realize at times that even though we look pretty normal on the outside, there's a lot of things going on the inside we may not necessarily be aware of.
Yes.
So that was something I've kind of carried with me and made me think that it's important to really be able to speak out, because like that grad student, there's going to be a lot of unaware people.
So you were very great. You kind of open your heart and accept yourself, but also educate the other person. That takes a lot to do that.
It does. And, because of that background I had, I'm very proud to be an ambassador for, the disability community. But that's not something that every person can do, because it takes a lot of steps to get there. So, if someone can just take that time, if someone with a disability can have that courage to be able to even, check out the AEC website or talk to the secretary, I think that's really wonderful. And I would be very proud of them for being able to do that for themselves.
I think it takes lots of courage to do that.
It does.
So what would you, so in ending, what would you say to a faculty or any fellow student, things that you would ask them to do or to support a student with hearing loss?
To the faculty, I would say, it helps to maybe have a little bit of background knowledge of a special need, but the more important thing is to be willing to learn about it and to be, willing to take that extra time to accommodate the student as they possibly can.
Meaning ask the student directly, how can I help, or what?
At
is this something
times,
to do?
yes.
Okay.
At times, yes. But because the disclosure rate is so low, I think one thing professors can do is just make their door open to the students. I understand that on every syllabus, they're required to include a paragraph or two about the AEC services. So in the beginning of the year, teachers go over the syllabus, and a lot of times they kind of skim over the AEC things, the AEC section. So what I would tell them is just take a little bit of extra time on that and say, something to the students like, as you may be aware, there are services for people with special needs, students like yourself. Don't be afraid to check it out and see what they have available. And if you need my help, please let me know. My door is always open. Kind of cultivating that really positive and open environment and making it feel safe for the students to say, oh, this professor, this faculty member is someone that I could talk to. But there will be situations, I think, when it can be helpful for the professor to actually go up to the student and just check on them. And that would have to be a case-by-case basis. I was actually in a really unfortunate situation when I was taking extra classes at another university where I was slipping through the cracks. And this was a very rare situation for me because, I love school and I'm always, to the best I can, trying to self-advocate for myself. But this was one particular situation where there were a lot of things going on in my life. And I didn't realize I was slipping through the cracks until finals week. And so although I passed the class, I think it would have been very helpful if, my teacher would have taken that time to say, hey, Erin, I noticed that, you're not really paying attention as much, or you don't seem to be hearing the things I'm saying. Just so you know, I'm here to support you academically if needed.
Yeah, teacher would have approached you earlier.
And it would have been kind of nice. But I also realize, we're all human beings. Teachers are busy. The AEC can be overworked. But if there is that situation where a professor or faculty member notices that a student can, needs a little bit of extra motivation or assistance or reassurance, do take that time because, we're in a really positive community in the university, and we want everyone to succeed, and so I think just taking that little extra time doesn't hurt.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. So anything else in closing, and to maybe your fellow student, or anything else you would like to share with us?
A couple things actually.
Okay.
So in terms of when we talk about the term disability, there is many ways there are other forms of terminology that you could utilize when describing somebody with a disability. You can say this person has a special need. This person has a differing ability. And those are just kind of like, alternative and maybe more neutral terminology that can be utilized. It's part of the reason why the Accessibility Education Center changed their name to the present one versus Disability Resource Center, because there's that little stigma attached to it. And the term disability can be kind of demeaning in some ways. It can sort of signify and make it sound like a person is less than the so-called normal population. I myself identify as someone with a disability because it's a really crucial part of who I am. But I also recognize that a lot of the stigma comes from society. And how people who may not necessarily be educated in the various sorts of differing special needs. So I think that's why it's so important to me to speak out about these sorts of issues and just kind of recognize that, we all have our different things that, we all have our little baggage, we all have extra things, other weaknesses, and it's just kind of a part of the human experience. And it just so happens that having a disability kind of brings us a little bit more closer to that. And this is just a message to individuals who have a disability and they are questioning whether or not they want to seek services, especially here. And what I would say to them is that they deserve those accommodations. They deserve that right to seek an education, and that is thanks to the civil rights that is administered by the Americans with Disability Act. And it says, you know, you have that right to seek education, to become, you know, a well-rounded citizen.
Yes.
And there are definitely disadvantages for people with disabilities, and having laws like that really makes it a reality that we do deserve those rights, and we should act upon seeking them out. Of course, it may not necessarily be easy. There's going to be roadblocks along the way. There's going to be lots of emails, lots of communication, lots of reevaluation of, is this accommodation going to help me or not? But in the long run, you know, we're here to get a college education. And with people like myself, we need that extra leverage to be able to be good students like our so-called normal counterparts. And so that's why I encourage individuals to really consider what self-advocacy can do for their education. And also, I think that if the students know the professors are willing to work with them, I think that can make the environment a lot more approachable. And I also would just want the students to know that it's really hard sometimes having a disability, absolutely. But I think that there are a lot of things to gain from it too. If I didn't have a hearing loss, I don't think I would be as empathetic or open-minded or just understanding of people who may not have, you know, may not be as fortunate as I am. And I have to remind myself, living in the Bay Area, having a degree, that's something that many people, you know, strive to be.
It's a major achievement.
It's a major achievement, and it's a huge honor. And I hope that, you know, sharing my story as someone who with a hearing loss will, you know, encourage people with disabilities to think that, hey, it's okay to be who I am. And also for the faculty here at San Jose State to realize, you know, we all just need a little extra help, and we always appreciate it. It's all here.
Thank you, Erin.
Thank you.